The sound of shattering glass snapped me out of a deep sleep. I shot upright in bed, heart racing. For a second, I thought someone was breaking in. I grabbed my phone, flipped on the bedroom light, and crept toward the hallway. Another crash. This time it was louder, closer. I yanked open my bedroom door and sprinted to the living room. That's when I saw her. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, holding a garden stone in her hand like it was a baseball. Standing in my flower bed. Trudy Whitmore, Vice President of the Briar Glen HOA. "Are you out of your mind?" I shouted through the now completely shattered front window. She looked up, totally unfazed. "You left the house closed up for too long, Xavier. It's not healthy. Mold grows when there's no circulation." I stared at her, stunned. "So you decided to, what, ventilate my house with a rock?" She dropped the stone into my begonias. "Yes, and you're welcome." I was too stunned to speak. This woman had just thrown a rock through my window. My freaking window. And she was acting like she'd just watered my plants. Now, let me backtrack a second here. My name's Xavier Preston. I'm a lawyer, been practicing civil litigation for nearly 16 years. And I recently moved into Briar Glen, a neighborhood that practically brags about being the most strictly maintained community in the county. I bought the house from an elderly couple who'd retired to Florida, but I hadn't fully moved in yet. Just enough to set up the essentials while finishing up some things at my old place across town. Apparently, leaving your house closed up for a few days in Briar Glen is a cardinal sin. I stepped outside, barefoot, furious. "You're paying for that." "Every damn cent." Trudy gave me this tight, self-satisfied nod. "As a board member of the HOA, I am allowed to take emergency action to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood." "You broke my window." "Ventilation," she said calmly. Like that explained everything. I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was actually insane or just drunk on power. From the smug tilt of her chin, I was leaning toward the latter. "You know I'm a lawyer, right?" I said, arms crossed. Her eyes narrowed. So, I hope your HOA's insurance is paid up." Trudy turned on her heel and strutted back toward her golf cart like she'd just delivered a casserole. I watched her drive off, glass crunching under her tires. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I filed a police report. Officer McNeil came out, took photos, and wrote everything down. When I told him Trudy was part of the HOA, he sighed like he'd heard her name before. "Let me guess," he said. "She claimed it was some kind of neighborhood emergency?" "Yup." He shook his head. "We've had calls about her before. She once called us because someone had left their garage door open for more than 4 hours. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How does she still have any authority? She's the VP. Her husband used to be president until he got caught siphoning HOA funds into a fake landscaping company. Now she runs the board meetings like a dictatorship. Most of the residents are too scared or too tired to fight her." "Well," I said, "she just picked the wrong house this time." I wasn't bluffing. I didn't just practice law. I lived for cases like this. Property damage, abuse of authority, harassment. This was my bread and butter. But first, I needed evidence. I installed 2 Ring cameras that same day, one at the front door, one overlooking the driveway. Then I did something Trudy didn't expect. I started attending HOA meetings. The first one I went to was held at the community center. Trudy was at the front table, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they were just there to keep their heads down. She smiled as I walked in. "Ah, Mr. Preston. I hope your home is breathing better now." I didn't respond. Just sat in the front row and opened my notepad. The meeting was a circus. She called out people for leaving their trash bins out for longer than aesthetically acceptable, accused a family of unauthorized Halloween decorations, and spent 20 minutes discussing the optics of a neighbor's aging mailbox. It was clear. This wasn't about community upkeep. It was about control. When she tried to move on without addressing what happened at my house, I raised my hand. Yes, she said, clearly annoyed. I'd like to discuss the broken window incident. She waved a hand. We've already resolved that. It was an emergency ventilation measure. According to who? The board. I looked at the two board members beside her. Were either of you consulted before she damaged my property? They both looked uncomfortable. One of them, a guy named Greg, cleared his throat. No, I wasn't. I heard about it after. Same, said the other woman, Dana. Trudy's face twitched. Well, as vice president, I have the authority to act unilaterally in emergencies. I leaned forward. You do know that the HOA's charter requires any emergency action involving property entry to be voted on by the board or, at the very least, documented in writing beforehand? Trudy blinked. Would you like me to read the clause out loud? I have a copy of the charter right here. She snapped. This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Preston. No, I said, but it's a public meeting. And I'm making a formal motion that the board conduct an internal review of your actions and reimburse me for the damage. She tried to shut me down, but Greg seconded the motion. Dana looked horrified, but she nodded. Motion passed. After the meeting, Greg pulled me aside. Look, man, I'm glad you're here. She's been running this place like her own kingdom. Nobody's stood up to her in years. Well, I said, that's about to change. 2 days later, I received a letter from the HOA. Not a reimbursement, not an apology note. It was a violation notice. According to Trudy, I had failed to properly secure and maintain my property, which invited community risk and required emergency intervention. I laughed out loud when I read it. She really thought she could play that angle. What she didn't realize was that I'd already filed a pre-litigation claim with the HOA's insurance provider, and I'd CC'd the board. The letter she sent me? It was retaliation, which under the law only made my case stronger. I wasn't just gunning for reimbursement anymore. Now I wanted her removed. And if I had my way, arrested. Greg called me 2 nights later. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. You're not gonna believe this. I'm starting to believe anything when it comes to her. She's calling a special board meeting. Closed session. No residents allowed. She says it's about pending legal exposure and security concerns. I leaned back in my chair and ran a hand over my face. So she's trying to bury it. Looks that way. I think she's planning to push a motion to classify the window thing as a protected HOA intervention under some obscure clause. She's trying to retroactively justify it after the fact. Exactly. And if she gets the board to vote on it without homeowners present, it'll give her leverage to block your insurance claim. She's not just trying to avoid blame, I said. She's weaponizing the board's authority to rewrite the facts. Greg hesitated. I can't stop her alone. But if you can find something stronger than just the window, something that connects her actions to a pattern, we might have a shot at more than just pushing back. We could remove her. I didn't answer right away. I was already opening my laptop. Leave it to me, I said. I spent the next 3 days combing public records, contracts, and HOA meeting archives. I wasn't just looking for dirt, I needed something concrete. Something that couldn't be explained away as strict enforcement or miscommunication. By the second night, I found it. A landscaping contract from 8 months ago. The vendor listed was Green Earth Solutions. A generic name, but the address on the invoice didn't sit right. I ran it through the county records. Turns out it was registered to a single-family home in a nearby town. The house belonged to Trudy's niece. Green Earth Solutions had billed the HOA for over $25,000 that quarter. But there were no work logs, no service reports, not even a single receipt for supplies. I cross-referenced it against the HOA's financial statements. The same company had been paid quarterly for the past 2 years. $98,000 total. That wasn't just negligence. That was embezzlement. I printed every document I had, stapled them into a folder, and made 2 copies, one for the police and one for the county's HOA Oversight Division. Then I called Officer McNeil again. When I told him what I'd found, he asked me to bring everything down to the station. I did. And when he saw the documents, his jaw tightened. "This is fraud," he said. Flat out. And if the board didn't sign off on this, she could be looking at criminal charges. Greg and Dana didn't know anything about it. She's been filing these payments under routine landscaping expenses. He looked up. "You willing to testify?" "Absolutely." That same afternoon, detectives were dispatched to the HOA's office at the community center. They left with 2 boxes of files, a desktop tower, and a very startled-looking Trudy who had been mid-lunch when they arrived. I got a call from Greg an hour later. He sounded breathless. "She's freaking out. She told the board it's a misunderstanding and that her niece was just helping coordinate vendors." "Did she admit the payments?" "She said they were reasonable maintenance costs. But when the cops started asking about the non-existent work orders, she started blaming the treasurer." "Who's the treasurer?" "Trudy." I didn't laugh. I wanted to, but I didn't. A day later, I received a certified apology letter from the HOA signed by Greg and Dana. It stated that the board had voted to suspend Trudy's authority pending further investigation and that my window repair costs would be covered in full. But that wasn't enough for me. Because the damage she'd done wasn't just to my house. It was to the entire neighborhood. I started knocking on doors. At first, most people were hesitant. They'd heard rumors, some had even received violation letters for trivial things like using the wrong shade of mulch or leaving holiday lights up for an extra weekend. But they'd never connected the dots. Once I showed them the documents, the payments, the arrest warrant issued for Trudy's niece, they started talking. A retired Army medic told me Trudy had fined him for unauthorized fencing when he put up a privacy screen around his backyard hot tub. A single mother said she was once told her kids' sidewalk chalk art was graffiti. Another woman had been cited for excessive doorbell use after her teenage son rang a neighbor's bell twice in one visit. The stories piled up. Dozens of residents who had been harassed, fined, or intimidated into submission. I compiled the statements, redacted names for privacy where necessary, and submitted a formal petition to the County HOA Regulatory Board. The petition called for the immediate appointment of an independent auditor and a vote to dissolve and reharder the HOA's leadership structure altogether. 3 days later, a hearing was scheduled. It was held in the municipal building downtown. Standing outside the hearing room that morning, I watched as Trudy arrived with a lawyer in tow. Her expression had changed. Not smug, not dismissive, just pale. She walked right past me without saying a word. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. I presented the evidence with the same precision I used in court. The forged contracts, the misuse of funds, the retaliatory violation letter, testimonies from 10 residents, the ring footage showing her trespassing onto my property with the garden stone. Even the police report she had tried to downplay. Her attorney tried to cast doubt on everything. Said I had a personal vendetta. Claimed Trudy had acted in good faith to preserve safety standards. But nothing stuck. And then Greg took the stand. His voice didn't waver. "She bullied us," he said. "Every meeting. Every vote. If we questioned her, she'd threaten to fine us or drum up complaints. Most of us just went along to avoid being targeted." Dana followed him. Quiet but firm. "I found out about the landscaping payments a week ago. I was never consulted. I don't even know who Green Earth Solutions is. I thought we used Jackson Lawn." The regulatory board didn't need long. Within 24 hours, Trudy was formally removed from her position. The HOA was placed under temporary county supervision until a new election could be held. A criminal investigation into financial misconduct was opened, and I was asked to join the interim committee helping draft the new HOA charter. I accepted, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that unchecked power only grows in silence. But turn on the lights and cockroaches scatter. The window she broke cost $600 to replace. The lawsuit I filed against her personally for trespassing, destruction of private property, and emotional distress, that was worth a whole lot more, and I made sure the whole neighborhood knew it. 3 weeks after the hearing, I found myself standing in front of a folding table at the Briar Glen Community Center, arms crossed, watching the last remnants of Trudy's regime being boxed up and hauled away. Stacks of outdated violation forms, a half-filled wine glass with lipstick on the rim, and a binder labeled Uniformity Enforcement were among the final items removed. No one said a word. Even the maintenance guys looked relieved as they carried out her monogrammed office chair. Greg approached, holding a clipboard with the names of the newly appointed interim committee members. He looked like he'd aged in reverse since the last vote, less drawn, more relaxed. "I still can't believe she left behind a binder with that title," he muttered. "Sounds like something from a dystopian handbook." I glanced toward the empty bulletin board where she used to post passive-aggressive notices about lawn heights and mailbox paint colors. "It fits. She ran this place like a HOA-themed boot camp." Greg handed me the clipboard. "We've got just enough people to form the interim governance committee. You're listed as legal liaison." "You good with that?" "Only if I get to write the new bylaw about board members being banned from ornamental stoning of occupied homes." He gave a short laugh and moved off to wrangle the last of the volunteers. I stayed behind, watching the space clear out. It should have felt like a victory lap, and in some ways, it did, but I had this gnawing feeling in the back of my mind. Something still didn't sit right. I'd been through enough litigation to know when a case had loose threads. And Trudy's unraveling had too many. The landscaping fraud explained one angle, sure. But it didn't explain the extent of her control, how she'd managed to scare dozens of residents into silence, or how she'd casually committed property damage without blinking. She wasn't just drunk on power. She was hiding something. I didn't have to wait long to find out what. Later that week, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single printed photograph, old, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Trudy, about 10 years younger, standing beside a man in front of a commercial building. The building's sign read, Crescent Property Services. I recognized the name immediately. Crescent had a reputation in the city for two things: aggressively managing HOA contracts across multiple subdivisions and racking up lawsuits for extortionate fines, unlawful liens, and coercive evictions. They'd been sued at least 3 times in the past decade, but always managed to walk away intact. The man beside her was Arthur Denslow, Crescent's founder and CEO. He'd disappeared from the public eye years ago after a civil suit exposed his company's practice of using shell vendors to inflate maintenance costs and redirect funds. The case had settled quietly. No criminal charges were filed. That's when it clicked. Trudy wasn't just embezzling. She was part of something bigger. I spent the next 4 nights digging. Trudy had never been officially listed as a Crescent employee, but her niece, the one whose name was on the landscaping shell company, had. Briefly, 2 years before the first Green Earth Solutions payment appeared in Briar Glen's financials. I pulled up Crescent's vendor contract database, which had been leaked during discovery in an older class action lawsuit. Green Earth Solutions had been listed there, too, alongside a dozen other companies that existed for less than a year before vanishing. It wasn't a coincidence. Trudy had learned from Denslow. She'd lifted his exact playbook and applied it to Briar Glen. Only this time she'd gotten caught. What worried me wasn't what she'd done, it was who else might have been involved. I passed everything to Officer McNeil, who immediately looped in the county's Financial Crimes Task Force. They pulled the HOA's last 5 years of vendor payments, subpoenaed emails from the old HOA email server, and began cross-referencing vendor addresses with known shell companies linked to Crescent. 3 days later, they found a second one. This time, it was a pest control service called Apex Barrier Solutions. Paid nearly $15,000 over 2 years. The address belonged to a vacant lot. The next morning, Trudy was arrested again, this time not just for misappropriation, but for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and laundering HOA funds through fictitious vendors. And she wasn't alone. Her former secretary, a man named Roy Henders, was booked the same afternoon. He'd been the one processing the payments and submitting dummy invoices. He also happened to be a former Crescent employee who'd been fired shortly before the company's civil collapse. The news hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. I walked into the local coffee shop on Saturday morning, and the barista who I'd never spoken to before gave me a free muffin and said, "Thanks for taking down the HOA mafia." By Monday, the story had gone citywide. Local news vans parked outside Briar Glen's entrance. A reporter asked if I'd give a statement. I declined. I didn't want to be the face of the fallout. I just wanted to make sure the cleanup was done properly. But the damage Trudy left behind wasn't just financial. Residents were coming out of the woodwork with stories of threats, intimidation, and coercion. A couple revealed that they'd been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fines that no one could trace to legitimate violations. One woman said Trudy had told her she'd lose her house over a crooked curtain rod. Greg and I organized a weekend legal clinic at the community center. I called in 3 colleagues from my firm, and we spent 2 days reviewing documents and helping residents file formal complaints and claims. Several had liens placed on their properties under false pretenses, liens signed by Roy Henders. We helped them draft motions to nullify the liens and filed them with the county clerk's office. In every case, the paperwork had procedural errors that invalidated them on site. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became. Trudy's HOA wasn't just corrupt. It was predatory. The final blow came when the county prosecutor announced charges not just against Trudy and Roy, but also against Crescent's former general counsel. Turns out, the legal templates used to create the fake vendor contracts matched those from Crescent's original fraud case word for word. They'd recycled the templates and trusted that no one would notice. But I did. At the next neighborhood meeting, now fully open to residents and held outdoors under string lights and folding chairs, a vote was held to approve the new HOA charter. I watched as families showed up with their kids, couples brought lawn chairs, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in years greeted each other like old friends. When the final count was tallied, the charter passed unanimously. It included a mandatory external audit every year, term limits for board members, and a clause that required any fine over $50 to be approved by at least 2 separate board members and reviewed by a third-party compliance officer. No more unilateral decisions. No more secret vendor contracts. No more Trudy. After the vote, Dana approached me. She was carrying a folder of paperwork and a bottle of sparkling apple cider. "I never thought we'd get here," she said, handing me the bottle. "You want to do the honors?" I popped the cork, careful not to aim it toward the string lights. A cheer went up from the crowd. Dana leaned in closer. "You know, people are saying we should rename the community center. Call it Preston Hall." I shook my head. "Let's just settle for fewer broken windows." "Fair enough." As the crowd clinked plastic cups and kids chased fireflies across the lawn, I looked around at what Briar Glen had become, not perfect, not polished, but finally free from the grip of a woman who thought HOA stood for her own authority. And as far as I was concerned, that was a settlement worth celebrating. The morning after the charter passed, Briar Glen felt different. Doors were open. Lawns were dotted with neighbors chatting while walking dogs or sipping coffee. For the first time since I moved in, I saw people linger outside their homes without glancing over their shoulders. But that calm didn't last long. 3 days later, Greg showed up at my door holding a USB drive and a folded manila folder. He didn't look panicked, he looked disturbed, like someone who'd just seen the edge of a cliff and realized how close he'd been to falling. "I wasn't going to bother you," he said. But this was in the storage room, hidden behind the insulation panel above the ceiling tiles. I only found it because we were clearing out the HVAC filter. I took the drive and the folder and motioned him inside. He sat on the edge of my couch like he didn't want to touch anything, arms stiff at his sides. I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened the only file on it, a video labeled Parcel B contingency footage. The footage had been recorded by a trail cam, likely one of those motion-triggered wildlife cams. It was grainy, black and white, and timestamped 2 years ago before I'd moved in. It showed a wooded lot on the north edge of the neighborhood, technically owned by the HOA and labeled unbuildable in the original community plan. Nothing unusual at first, just trees and a dirt path. Then a truck pulled into frame. It was unmarked, headlights off. 2 men stepped out. One opened the tailgate. The other dragged something heavy, a tarp-covered object, into the underbrush. They worked quickly, shoveling dirt and covering whatever it was. At one point, one of them turned toward the camera, and though the resolution was low, I recognized him instantly. Roy Henders. I paused the footage. Greg was staring at the screen, throat working like he couldn't swallow. "The folder," he finally said. "It's worse." Inside were aerial photos taken by drone, recent ones. They showed the same parcel of land. One photo had red circles drawn around disturbed soil, and an annotation in handwriting I didn't recognize. Primary deposit point. Don't revisit. There was more. A printed email exchange between Trudy and Roy, weeks before the footage was taken. Roy had written, "Parcel B is still viable. Just need to keep maintenance off it." Trudy had replied, "Understood. I'll mark it as off limits due to erosion risk." I looked up. "You think what I think?" Greg nodded, face pale. "I think there's something buried there, and I think they didn't want anyone finding it." I called Officer McNeil. He came within the hour, this time with 2 detectives from the county's Environmental Crimes Unit. I handed over the footage, the photos, and the emails. They didn't ask many questions, just took everything and left a file for a warrant. 2 days later, the county brought in ground-penetrating radar. They swept the parcel, sectioned it into quadrants, and flagged 3 anomalies beneath the surface, each roughly the size of a large trash bin. I stayed behind the yellow tape with Greg and Dana, who'd been looped in once the police confirmed it was tied to HOA property. The scene was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes with held breath and heavy questions. When the first dig team hit something hard, I felt Greg tense beside me. It wasn't a body. It was worse. They unearthed a cache of illegally dumped materials, hazardous chemicals, including outdated pesticide canisters and industrial sealants banned by the EPA a decade ago. Several containers had burst, leaching into the soil. It would take weeks to determine how much had seeped into the groundwater. Dana watched the excavation with her hand over her mouth. The detectives returned to my house that evening to inform me that the parcel had been used as an illegal dumping site for years. Trudy and Roy had deliberately buried restricted waste to avoid disposal fees. The chemicals matched those used by Crescent's maintenance vendor in another HOA case, one that had quietly settled in another county after several pets died and a child developed respiratory complications. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It was environmental crime. The EPA got involved. The state attorney's office launched a criminal investigation into Crescent's entire history of HOA contracts and vendor relationships. Trudy, already awaiting trial for financial crimes, was hit with new federal charges under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Roy was arrested again, this time without bail. And the fallout? It hit hard. The county declared Parcel B a contamination zone, fenced it off, and began environmental remediation. The cleanup would take at least a year and cost more than $200,000. Trudy's personal assets were frozen. Her house was seized. Roy's accounts were emptied, and Crescent's former legal counsel was disbarred. The state issued a public statement condemning the exploitation of HOA structures for criminal enterprise. Briar Glen's residents were furious not just at the crime, but at how long it had gone unnoticed. A neighborhood meeting was held outdoors again, but this time it wasn't celebratory. It was somber, united by a shared sense of betrayal. I stood at the front, not as a lawyer, but as a neighbor. The system failed here, I said. Not just because of who was in power, but because we were taught not to question it. That ends today. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I proposed a new oversight committee, one separate from the HOA, entirely an elected group of residents tasked with reviewing all future contracts, expenditures, and environmental decisions. It passed unanimously. I volunteered to serve on it for 1 year, then stepped down. Because power, once held too long, becomes the very thing we fought against. The following month, I received a call from the state attorney's office. They'd finalized the settlement in the civil suit I'd filed on behalf of the neighborhood. With the evidence and testimony I'd provided, the court awarded Briar Glen a full restitution package. reimbursement for the environmental cleanup, repair funds for all homes affected by fraudulent fines, and a community development grant to install sustainable landscaping and water filtration systems. The check arrived with a note, "Justice with interest." I used my portion to fund a scholarship program for students pursuing environmental or civil law. The first recipient, a local high school senior whose family had nearly lost their home to one of Trudy's fake liens. Months passed. The fence around Parcel B stayed up, but grass began to grow again. The air felt cleaner. Neighbors planted trees together, started composting, even organized a community garden. And Trudy? She took a plea deal. 28 months in federal prison followed by 5 years probation. No chance of ever serving on any board or handling public funds again. Her last words in court, I was told, were that she only wanted to keep the neighborhood clean. She did the opposite. But in the end, her downfall became Briar Glen's rebirth. On the 1-year anniversary of the charter vote, we held a block party. Not the kind with politicians or speeches. Just food, music, and laughter. Kids played in the sprinklers. Elders shared folding chairs. Someone brought out a projector and played old movies on a bedsheet. No one mentioned Trudy. No one needed to. Her name had become a ghost, one that no longer haunted the sidewalks or hid behind violation notices. At the edge of the party, Greg raised a cup toward me. "You ever think you'd spend your weekends doing this?" I shook my head. I came here to get away from litigation. Turns out I moved right into a case file. He laughed once. "You think it's over now?" I looked around. Neighbors chatting. Kids with popsicles. Music drifting under a clear sky. "Yeah," I said. "I think it finally is." And in that moment, surrounded by the kind of peace that only comes after a storm, I finally believed it.